Good day and welcome back to Give the People What They Want. I know it's been a little sporadic. I was out last week, a little sick, but we're back. And most importantly, we're here to give you very important analysis and updates on things that are happening across the world. That we'll never stop doing. There's a lot to say, of course. 2 years since the beginning of Israel's genocide against Gaza. Lots happening with protests in different countries across the world. So we'll be back with all of that and more.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
So I think for a lot of us, the first week of October 2023, in many ways came as a surprise. Many of us couldn't have known how drastically the world would shift and transform following what was October 7th in Gaza and the operation that was carried out by the Palestinian resistance. Even, over with our project in People's Dispatch and NewsClick, we were reeling from a massive government raid on the over 100 offices and homes of reporters and journalists, massive crackdown on press freedom. And, as journalists, when this happened, obviously on October 7th, despite having just suffered a massive repressive attack, we knew that what we needed to do was talk about Palestine. So Prasanth, we're 2 years out. And I know that even on People's Dispatch, at first we were framing it as like, okay, what's happening in 2023? What's happening in 2023? Then we realized it was continuing to 2024. We're in 2025 now. Tell us a little bit about what's been happening, some of the shifts that you've seen and where we stand today.
Right, Zoe. I think it's because we are living through something very unprecedented. A lot of people have pointed out that this is the first time in human history that genocide is being live streamed, and we've all talked about it in multiple episodes here, articles. We've been reading about it. People are on the streets constantly, but I think it's important to sometimes maybe use this occasion, generally step back and think about what we are seeing being so unprecedented in our lifetimes, definitely. But even if you look at our recent human history or the post-1950s here, post-World War history, for instance, what we are seeing is something definitely unprecedented here. And that's for a variety of reasons. One, like we talked about, the nature of genocide itself being live streamed. Two, the fact that the kind of impunity Israel has, there have been other genocides before in the past 50 to 70 years, there's no question about it. But the kind of impunity that Israel has enjoyed as a perpetrator of genocide is something completely unprecedented. We have seen how the United States, its allies in the West, many governments across the world. To be fair, the people in most parts of the world have been on the streets constantly protesting. Many countries have taken very strong stances, and over the last 2 years, we've seen an increasing number of countries doing that. For instance, we know that countries that had a strong anti-imperialist perspective from day one onwards were very strongly opposing this, but that number has expanded to even certain allies of Israel who are now making way more noises. But nonetheless, the fact is that with the help of a very small number of countries, and this help is not just moral, it is financial, through weapons, it is by legal cover. Israel has continued to enjoy impunity to continue this genocide, despite the presence of the International Court of Justice, despite the presence of the International Criminal Court. Now, it's a very important question as to what it means for all these kind of institutions, what it means for this world order. The numbers, we've talked about quite often. The most conservative estimate is around over 67,000 people killed, but that absolutely does not, in any way measure the kind of havoc. We're talking about entire families, entire generations destroyed. We're talking about places like Gaza City, for instance, which is a complete rubble. We're talking about generation, if you're looking at disabilities that are created due to the war, if you're talking about the long-term impacts of starvation, if you're talking about the impact on women and children, you talk about mental health, you're talking about so many. It's it's impossible to really describe in a few sentences or even in one report, a big report, the kind of large-scale impact. And nonetheless, it is also important, very important to note that what the Palestinian people have been through the past 2 years continuously doing is struggling, resisting, and documenting this struggle and resistance. And I think that's a very, very important part of it. And that is also because of this tradition of struggle. And I think one of the most important things we need to keep shouting from the rooftops as it is that this is a story that began in the 40s, right? This is a story of resistance. This is a story of fight back. This is a story of resilience that began in the 40s. Generation after generation of Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, in Lebanon, across the world have been waging this resistance, and that's very important to remember. I think the third part, which is connected to the first point, is the fact that Israel is used this as an opportunity to, try to establish its larger genocidal goal on the ground, which is the elimination of the Palestinian state, of the Palestinian identity itself. This is not, it's very clear, this is not a war against Hamas. This is not a war to get back the hostages. This is an attempt to destroy the Palestinian state, to destroy the Palestinian identity itself. If they could, this is what they would probably do in the West Bank as well, right? So we need to be very clear about that. And also we need to be clear that the Israeli agenda has become more clear by the fact that through the attacks on Iran, through the attack on Lebanon, what it has been doing in Syria, the attacks on Yemen, it is clearly an attempt to sort of, reshape the entire region with Israel as the dominant power. But it has failed to do that in the past 2 years, and I think that is the important thing. It has failed because people across the region have resisted. It has failed because people in every part of the world have continuously taken to the streets facing repression. It has failed because of the activists on the flotillas you're going to talk about. That it has failed because time and again Palestinians have refused to obey orders. They have marched back to their homes. They've taken control of their homes in Gaza, even if those territories are bombarded and completely destroyed. And it has failed because Palestinian journalists, Palestinian medical professionals, Palestinian aid workers, ordinary Palestinians have continued to insist that they will not bow before this genocidal machine. So I think 2 years down the line, this is where we're at. And in some senses, we can talk about maybe the negotiations and all next week. It's still too early to say, and it's a very complicated issue. But I think when we step back, these are some of the aspects that we need to sort of, think about and talk about and keep talking about, because those numbers on the streets are having an impact, irrespective of sometimes all of us feel a sense of despondency, the fact that, what does all of this matter if the genocide continues like this? But I think those numbers are having an impact, and that is being seen at every forum.
Well, Prasanth, I'd say it's really difficult to even try to summarize what the past 2 years has meant, what we've seen, and how it's transformed, the globe, ourselves, life itself. But I think you did a pretty good job. And of course, there's so much more to say, but I think it's interesting that another major development has kind of coincided with this 2-year anniversary, which is the Global Sumud Flotilla, which we've been covering a lot on People's Dispatch and of course on Morningstar as well, which has been this pretty monumental effort to once again try to break the blockade on Gaza, which, by the way, didn't start on October 7th. It was intensified, but of course the blockade on Gaza has been in existence for, over a decade and a half. And so this attempt by nearly 500 international volunteers and activists aboard over 40 vessels, as we know, last week was intercepted by Israeli authorities, as all of the previous flotillas have been. In this massive operation by the Israelis to again intercept these vessels in international waters, which we know is completely illegal, and then proceeded to kidnap these over 400 activists. Some were held as long as 5 days in Israeli prison. They were brought to a prison in the desert, in the Negev desert, which is infamous for its horrific treatment of Palestinian prisoners. And these international activists were given a taste of what Palestinian prisoners face on a daily basis, a condition which has been greatly worsened and intensified their treatment since October 7th. There has been, horrific reports coming out about the treatment that Palestinian prisoners have faced, many actually having died in custody. And so these international activists were given a taste of that, treated, as Itamar Ben-Gvir said, as, quote unquote, terrorists. He wanted to treat them in a certain way. He wanted to intimidate people. And, as you said, Prasanth, all of these efforts, of course, not discounting the treatment and the horrific treatment that people faced. It's crazy that they still think that using these desperate tactics of humiliation, of mistreatment, of torture are going to in some way dissuade the people. There's millions of people across the world that have had their eyes opened to the reality of Israel's genocidal and colonial project, have had their hearts opened and said, I can't be at peace if the genocide against the Palestinian people is continuing, and that have really changed their lives in order to enter the struggle and participate in the struggle for Palestinian liberation. So, if they thought that by torturing and by humiliating activists in an Israeli prison and actually showing them firsthand what they've been doing constantly, the Palestinians, they thought that they would somehow stop the movement. I think they were, of course, greatly mistaken. And we've seen really moving testimonies of people that have been deported back to their home countries. Of course, the treatment that Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg faced, the treatment that many people faced, really, really moving stuff. And of course, always bringing it back to the situation in Gaza and the inaction of world leaders. There was another vessel and several vessels that were intercepted, I think, just some hours back, another attempt to break the blockade. I think what's clear here is that the people of the world will continue to mobilize, and they will continue to show their leaders that they do not agree with their policies. There was a recent poll that came out in the United States showing a number of things which indicate a massive shift in public opinion. Let's remember the US has been the historic social base and stronghold for Zionism and support for the Zionist project, and especially, of course, the North American Jewish population. Well, a recent poll actually indicates that 61% of Jews in the United States believe that Israel has committed war crimes in Gaza, and a significant majority also believe that what Israel's doing is wrong. So I think, these shifts are not free. These shifts have been fought for on the street, have been a product of Israel's depravity and its horrific treatment of the Palestinian people. But these shifts are consequential, and it shows when people are continuing to be on the street pressuring their governments. I mean, we've seen governments take ridiculous stances in order to clamp down on the movement. I mean, the case of banning Palestine Action, the fact that an 80-year-old cannot hold a sign that says Palestine, we support Palestine Action in Britain right now, under a Labour government, no less. I know Roger has, of course, been covering this a lot, is just shows they are so desperate. They're so desperate for this movement to die. They're so desperate for people to not care about the actions that governments are taking to support the genocide, as you said, Prasanth. It is now a small group, but they continue to finance, they continue to sell weapons to Israel. They continue to make this genocide possible, but people are not having it. So, it's really important at this anniversary to take into account all of those elements, not only the horror and the devastation, but the resistance of the people across the world, inspired by the heroic resistance of the Palestinian people. And as you said, Prasanth, this is a long struggle, the struggle against imperialism, the struggle against colonialism. Unfortunately, does not go as fast as we would want, but I think that the hope and the feeling amongst many people is that this desperation really shows that we are at the end of the road in a lot of ways with such a project, and that the days are numbered for Zionism and for Israel. So with that, touch on it a little bit, but you would think the UK, it loves to talk about democracy, it loves to talk about human rights, and everything else it loves to talk about. Roger, what's the situation of human rights in your country right now?
Well, that would be longer than we've got for this program, I think. But one of the things that is really interesting about the kind of clampdown on protests in Britain is, as you said, Zoe, where we've got elderly people who are arrested and carried away by the police from demonstrations for the crime of saying that they support Palestine action, who've never committed any kind of any offence against any individual. While at the same time, there's footage now that shows how one demonstrator was on a march with a sign that says, "I support genocide." And he was able to walk through and beg the police to arrest him, and they said, "No, you have freedom of speech in this country." Well, clearly not, because the people who were expressing their freedom of speech about the rights of the Palestinians were arrested summarily by the authorities. Now, it's got to such a stage now that the thousands upon thousands of people who've been turning out every week across Britain in demonstrations, many local, but also massive demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom have never marched before, are now under threat of a new law that's being proposed by the new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood. Now, Shabana Mahmood represents a seat in Birmingham, one of the most multicultural cities in Britain, the second city of Britain to London in many ways. And what she said is that these so-called repeat rallies need to have legislation against them because so many Jewish communities, she's saying, are now afraid because of these demonstrations that are taking place on a regular basis. Of course, she completely ignores all the Jewish comrades who are part of these demonstrations, who are marching for the rights of the Palestinians as well. Now, it gets even worse than this, because Shabana Mahmood was some years ago, not so very long ago, on massive demonstrations herself supporting the Palestinians. There's plenty of footage of her speaking where she's standing up rightly for the rights of the Palestinians. Now, having been appointed as Home Secretary, so one of the top jobs in the British government, representing the Labour Party, this party that allegedly is led by a human rights lawyer, she is now saying that, yes, you have the right to march, but not all the time. And that's essentially what she is saying. And I wish that was an exaggeration on my part, but it's not. That's exactly what she's saying. So she's saying that there's that the right to protest, the right to exercise your right to protest is conditional on whether or not the police feel that you've marched too much. Now, I think this is really dangerous for the rest of the planet, frankly, because if it happens in Britain, then I think many other countries across the globe will also start looking at this as something they can do. It's not legislation yet, but I'm fearful that this is something that Labour, with their record of attacking civil liberties in this country, and I never thought I'd say that, but worse than the Conservative Party now, in terms of their attacks on civil liberties and their attacks on working class people. It seems to me that this is something they're not just flagging as a possibility, but it seems to me they're flagging as something they want to do. I'll just finish with this. It's really important that people are not put off by these threats by the government, that we maintain these marches, that we continue to stand up for the Palestinians. There's a huge march that's planned through London on Saturday, which I have the honour of being one of the speakers at. But we really need to make sure that as many people turn up to that as possible, and we make it the biggest march in the history of Britain.
Wow, Roger. I mean, for the police to decide when you've marched too much, it's really, I mean, wow. For them, probably once is enough. So that's it. I mean, and it's crazy to think that a party with labor in their name, labor, the movement that, of course, marched, picketed, waged industrial action to get, it's, anyways, really boggles the mind there. But, The right to protest is already under attack, and we know this because in places across the world, protesters are met not only with police just being there, but with live bullets, with rubber bullets, with attacks constantly. One of these places has been Peru, of course. This country has been kind of on the streets in a sort of permanent mobilization for several years, with, of course, facing massive repression. And currently, there's another wave of protests happening in Peru and its northern neighbor in Ecuador. In both countries being met with massive repression, and not just repression, but also campaigns of stigmatization, of harassment in the media, but also by government officials. And both protests have their own kind of motivations and their own composition. So I'll just try to go through them both briefly. As you're seeing on the screen right now, images from Peru. There has been, for the past 3 weeks now, kind of these mass mobilizations taking place in Peru's capital, Lima. These mobilizations were sparked by a reform to the pension law in the country by the government of Dina Boluarte. And for people who have been following People's Dispatch for the last several years, you'll know who Dina Boluarte is. If you haven't, I'll say quickly, she took power after the coup against Pedro Castillo. Despite the fact that she was the vice president of Pedro Castillo, she has completely done a 180 politically, which of course we've seen before, aligning with the country's elites, and most importantly, carrying out a wave of violent and mortal repression against protesters in the country. We know after the coup against Pedro Castillo, there was a wave of mass mobilization, not only in the capital, but in the rural regions of the country. It's estimated that over 60 people were killed by security forces, and Dina Boluarte, of course, was overseeing all of this and saying, actually, not only can you do this, but you're going to get immunity for these crimes. And now people are back on the streets, sparked by the pension law, but really fueled by a host of other issues, including, of course, her illegitimate government, but a wave of violence that has been making life unlivable and unbearable in the country's capital. There have been a wave of extortions and just constant violence by criminal groups that the government essentially has not been able to deal with. There's been a transportation workers strike because of this violence. So a lot of things on the table. Young people, of course, out on the streets, trade unions, and this is all being met with a lot of repression. And again, the media in Ecuador loves to call protesters terrorists and calls them kind of all sorts of things. That's continuing. And just to the north in Ecuador, indigenous people in the country, led by CONAIE, which is, of course, the most important social movement in Ecuador, the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities, has been on strike for over 2 weeks now against the elimination of a fuel subsidy by the government of Daniel Noboa. Daniel Noboa, the son of the richest person in Ecuador, Daniel Noboa, who's essentially trying to rewrite the constitution, who's trying to put foreign military bases in the country, and who has maintained a state of exception in the country in an alleged war against gangs, but has really been responsible for Ecuador becoming the most unsafe and the most violent country in Latin America, despite being one of the safest. So indigenous people are leading the struggle against Daniel Noboa, of course, again, motivated by the elimination of the fuel subsidy, but also because his attempts to change the constitution, a constitution that was written for the people, by the people, in the government of Rafael Correa. Very intense stuff. Someone has already been killed in the context of this strike by security forces. The repression continues. However, students are joining the strike. Trade unions are also joining the strike, and the momentum appears to be growing and not letting up. So the right to protest under attack across the world by the bullet or by the law. So people are continuing to resist this. And of course, we're going to continue to follow the developments in South America, in, of course, these two countries, but lots of stuff happening across the continent as well. We'll hop very quickly to Prasanth. No surprise, France has a new kind of political shakeup. Give us a summary of
yeah, I'm going to be very,
crisis.
very brief because, who knows, next week we'll be talking about another prime minister. It's quite likely because I think Sebastian Lecornu, who was appointed just about 20-25 days ago, resigned on Monday, has been told to have some more consultations by today, and who knows that tomorrow we might see a new face. But I'm not going to be talking about the people are irrelevant at this point. It's just one Macron stooge after the other. I think it's important to ask two questions. One, the fact that I think the crisis in France really shows something we need to be talking about much more often, and it's connected to something Roger was talking about, which is that so many of these countries in the global north, the doyens of capitalism, the erstwhile colonial countries are now facing such a massive crisis because of what is essentially shooting their own foot, the positions they've taken, the kind of extractive policies they initially conducted across the world, and when that did not work out, they followed it up with conducting those policies on their own working class. And all the struggles in France, there have been massive protests over the past many months, have been against, for years actually, have been against Macron's policies, which are clearly anti-worker policies. There is an alternative policy path forward, which the unions are talking about, the left is talking about. But despite the left being the single biggest force in parliament, Macron has preferred to get the support of the far right and form governments rather than actually invite a leader from the left, which is actually the biggest bloc. That itself shows that all this talk of democracy from them is complete nonsense. They are just pandering to the right wing and doing anything to keep the left away, because they know that bringing the left in brings the possibility of some alternative policies. And they also know that this whole deck of cards they've built, the point of the importance of austerity, the fact that there is no alternative except extreme neoliberalism, the fact that budget cuts are needed, all of these will crumble if actually when a clear alternative is presented. I think they know that. So instead of even giving a chance or even the remote possibility of that alternative, Macron and those like him will dig from the archives, so to speak, leader after leader who has no popular support, who has absolutely no mandate for anything, and install them as leaders. We're seeing this across Europe, like I said. And the crisis faced by so many of these countries, it's a much deeper structural crisis. They've completely gutted production. They have destroyed their own working class. They have cut spending across the board. They have stopped investing in the people, in services the people need to develop as a society, and the fault lines are clearly showing. So I think we're going to see much more of this in France, in UK, in so many countries in the global north. And I think so. While the political aspects, who becomes the prime minister is probably less relevant as opposed to the deeper structural crisis, which clearly Macron cannot address, or those of his ilk, whether it be Starmer, whether it be Merz in Germany. Many of those leaders who are parroting exactly those same lines, clearly nowhere in a position to address them.
Once again, Prasanth, very impressive summary skills, and I think exactly what you said is right. It doesn't matter who the prime minister is. I think what's underneath is really what's important. Roger, take us home. There's a major development, renewable energy overtaking coal. Is this good? Should we be happy about this?
We can be happy and concerned at the same time, if that's possible. There's renewables. There's a report out this week by a think tank called Ember. They found that for the very first time, renewables have overtaken fossil fuels as the main source of electricity across the globe. Great news, right? We're in the run-up to the COP conference in the Amazon next month. So, that's one positive. The problem, though, is that whilst we've got China kind of leading the way on those renewables, along with loads of African countries, and that's showing how a lot of these renewables, particularly solar, is now much cheaper to place than it used to be. That's all great news, and there's big kind of moves by the global majority to actually do something different and make progress on renewables. The bad news is that the United States and the 27 nations of the European Union are going in absolutely the opposite direction. So they're actually using more fossil fuels than they were before, which, given all their chat about how important it is to make progress, and the kind of tears that you often see at the COP conferences about, oh, where this is wonderful that we're making progress. Actually, they're going in the opposite direction. So it's going to be really interesting, the COP next month, to see whether there is going to be any movement on not just on renewables and getting some more commitments to move these major Western industrial powers to a position where they're actually going to stop damaging the environment in such a way as they are doing, and actually whether they will start to pay up to the global majority the money that they keep saying. Every COP that I can remember, they keep saying, well, we're giving some money to help them through the worst of all this. But actually, all of us three, we're covering stories all the time about the worsening climate, about landslides in India, about landslides, monsoon conditions heavier than normal in places like Nepal, weather incidents in the United States, across all of Europe, that are much worse than we've ever seen them. And there's an argument that maybe we're past the point of no return, actually. But it's still good. It's still good news that there are countries who are trying to make a difference and are trying to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. So all of this, as I said, is build up to COP, and we'll see what happens from there. But frankly, I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah, I'd say that's the correct attitude with any sort of COP. Also remarkable how the goalposts keep shifting. You can't use this, we're going to use it. Important to note that as well. That brings us to the end of the show. Really a whirlwind, so much to get to. Very lucky to be joined by such incredible journalists and analysts. Roger McKenzie, of international editor of Morningstar, and Prasanth, an Indian journalist. It's always great to be with them. Please follow, give the people what they want. Follow Morningstar. Bookmark the website. Follow People's Dispatch. We're on all social media platforms at People's Dispatch, and our website, peoplesdispatch.org. We go into a lot of these stories and more. Make sure you're not missing anything. You can subscribe to the newsletter as well. And we'll be back with you next week, probably with even more crazy news. So make sure to stay tuned. You can watch the episode on YouTube. You can also listen to it as a podcast, which is, sometimes a little easier. So we'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone. And, good luck out there.